but historically, the average person, 200 years, once they become aware of their sin, it takes them 200 years to sort themselves out. Can you see, if I don't become aware of the sin, it might take thousands of years. There's people we know from our first century life who are still in the same place they arrived in the spirit world, in the hells, as they were 2,000 years ago, because they haven't even become aware yet of their sin, let alone desiring to change it. Right? So it's going to require from you a decision, a choice, a decision. What are you going to choose to do? And also it's going to require a choice as to which way you're going to use to progress. Are you going to use the method to progress that is using your mind and mind dominant, or are you going to use this method to progress that involves receiving God's love and progress that way, which becomes very emotionally dominant? Those are the methods that are available to you. There are no other methods. I know the world says there is, but there isn't. Every other thing they say is all just slight variations of the mind method. You know? So when they talk about neuro-linguistic programming, or when they talk about, dealing with energy, or when they talk about, all other forms of progress, well, they're all just using mind, right? And none of them are God's way. And so there's really just two paths. And this is what I said in the first century to everyone. There's really just two ways. God's love will flow into your soul, and the net effect of it is a substance from God is flowing into your natural soul that doesn't have that substance. And the effect of that is that your soul changes. It starts changing. To have, you could say, standards that are way beyond human standards, right? And the more of this love you receive, the more capacity you have also to understand the universe in which you live, and also the more capacity to visit parts of the universe that the perfect natural man cannot visit and will never be able to visit. It makes sense to you? Now, these things, I must say to you, are a scientific fact. Now, for those on earth, it's hard to believe these facts. But once you become a spirit and you start investigating the possibilities of life as a spirit, you'll start to see that these things are facts. Now, Mary and I have had 2,000 years of experience of these facts. And we understand that for most people, when you first hear it, it sounds a bit like far-fetched. And it sounds a bit like, well, how can that really affect my life now? But if you plan for that life now, you will have major benefits when you arrive. And it's like going to any new country, really. It's like, let's say you decide here in Canada you want to visit, let's say you're going to visit Australia, right? Then you would know that it's the other side of the world. You've got to learn a bit about Australia. You've got to learn about their customs. You've got to learn about their immigration or their way to get in and the way to get out of the country. You've got to learn these things. Now, for an English-speaking country, that's not so difficult. But let's say you decide you want to visit, Venezuela. Now there will be a whole different set of things you're going to have to learn and prepare for before you travel. And if you go unprepared, you might not even be let into the country if you're unprepared. If you haven't got the right visas, you won't be let in. And you can think of the spirit life as the same way. Unless you have the appropriate visa, you are not going to get into the next sphere or the higher sphere of condition. And unless you have the appropriate visa, if you like, to get beyond the sixth sphere, you will never get there. And that visa is all about receiving God's love. That's the visa. That's the pass. That's the way you pass from the sixth to the seventh and then into the state of the eighth sphere, which is classified as a one with God. You have to have received some of God's love in order to do that. Now, God's not saying you have to do it. He's just saying in order to get to that location, you're going to have to do it. Now, there's a whole slew of reasons why. And one of the reasons is because in your mind, there are things above the sixth sphere that cannot be understood by the mind. Every area above the sixth sphere is designed that your emotions have to be engaged rather than just your mind. So the trouble with your mind, and the problem with the mind on earth, is it's become so dominant. And while you're dominant in your mind, you are thinking, my mind is supreme. My mind is going to get me to the place I want to be. But that's not the case. Above the sixth sphere, your mind has to be given up, actually. In the seventh sphere, the whole reason for that sphere is to help people go through the process of releasing their mind dominance and becoming emotionally dominant, soul dominant. That's what happens in the seventh sphere. That's the process you have to go through in the seventh sphere. To reach at one with God, you're going to have to do that. Right? Now, if you don't want to reach a one with God, well, then you don't have to do it. But if you want to be a one with God and have this sort of everlasting progress that can continue beyond the perfect natural man, you are going to have to do it. There is no choice. And you get to the stage where you go, I want to do it, because why wouldn't I want to do it? If that place is more loving, more beautiful, more blissful, why wouldn't I want to experience that thing that I wouldn't be able to experience as a perfect person? So there are a time in your future where you're going to have to give up the mind. It makes sense? In this process of progress. So your sincere longings are not generated by your mind. They're generated by your feelings. The problem with sin is that sin also affects your feelings. You have feelings for things that are out of harmony with love when you sin. So you can be using your mind to try to generate a sincere longing for God, and you can use your mind to try to not sin, and it's useless to you. You still will not get beyond the sixth sphere of the spirit world in your future if you do that. So even if you become completely sinless by using your mind to work through every one of your sins, you will not reach the seventh sphere of the spirit world. The visa to get into the seventh sphere is having received God's love to a certain degree, and also having come to understand that your emotions are far more important than your mind. To the point where you don't really worry about what you think about anymore. There's no thought anymore. There's only feelings that drive thoughts. Right? That transition must occur. Now, let's look at yesterday. When we had the discussion about pets, as soon as we identify the sin and present some logic about the sin, can you see the general thing that happens is I start worrying in my mind, oh no, what am I going to do now? I've got a pet. What do I do with that? What my children have got a pet. What do I do there? You know, you start worrying in your mind, and then in your mind, the thing that starts up is, if it's a sin, then I need to stop it. So what I'll do is I'll change my life from my decision-making process in my mind. I'll change my life some way to stop that particular sin. That doesn't change anything from God's perspective. If you want a relationship with God, you've got to change your feelings about it, not just your mind. And if you remember a lot of the comments that were made yesterday, a lot of you were thinking, had reactions to the discussion on pets, right? You had a reaction, and probably last night, a bit of reaction too, possibly, right, for some of you. And those reactions are your mind fighting this for its sin, while at the same time the soul is going to have to give up its sin. This introduces a conflict inside of you. Are you going to do the right thing only intellectually, or are you going to only do the right thing when you feel the right thing to do? What are you going to do? Now, you can stop things intellectually. You can. You can stop doing a sin intellectually. You can make a decision to stop using your mind. You can make a decision to stop the sin and be firm with yourself about stopping the sin and making sure you stop the sin and being conscious of it every day. And you can do that. That's what every person who's progressed to the sixth sphere historically has done. That's how they got there. And you can do that. And you can work through the feelings you have about that as you do that, because you will have feelings when you try to stop an action that you really want. So if you really want a pet and you need to stop having one, then you can see, I really want one, but I need to stop having one if you believe you need to. And then you're going to end up in this sort of state, aren't you, where your feelings are saying have one and your mind's saying don't have one. And eventually this war, the battle that's going on between your feelings and your mind, is going to have to be resolved in order for you to calm down, in order for you to become relaxed and peaceful again. This is one reason why a lot of people don't want to hear about their sin, right? Because every time they hear about a sin, there's an internal battle. The internal battle ramps up inside of yourself, and it's very uncomfortable, and it feels like now there's no peace. And this Jesus guy has just brought me no peace to my life now, right? And that's the way we think. We go, well, how do we deal with that? Oh, we just avoid him, and then we get to have some peace. But it's not going to work that way for you in the spirit world. Like, it's got nothing to do with me. It's got everything to do with God's law and what that's going to demand of you, right? And so at some point you'll come to realize that, and then realize there is a battle going on between the sin that's inside of you and then the methods you use to reduce that sin, to change that sin. And you have a choice of using a method, which is the perfect natural man's method, which is use your mind, shut down the desire to do the action, or feel the desire to do the action but don't do it, and then go through this internal conflict until that conflict is resolved emotionally. And that's what will be required for you to change most sins if you progress towards the perfect natural man. And that's going to take a long time, right? The average person to reach from Earth to the sixth sphere takes 200 years. Once they know what to do. Now, it may take them 1,000 years to learn what to do, and then 200 years to do it. The average person takes 200 years. It's very rare. We have met some people who've taken 50 years, but they've lived a very moral life on Earth, which is not what we see happening very much nowadays. But historically, the average person, 200 years, once they become aware of their sin, it takes them 200 years to sort themselves out. Can you see, if I don't become aware of the sin, it might take thousands of years. There's people we know from our first century life who are still in the same place they arrived in the spirit world, in the hells, as they were 2,000 years ago, because they haven't even become aware yet of their sin, let alone desiring to change it, right? So it's going to require from you a decision, a choice, a decision. What are you going to choose to do? And also it's going to require a choice as to which way you're going to use to progress. Are you going to use the method to progress that is using your mind and mind dominant, or are you going to use this method to progress that involves receiving God's love and progress that way, which becomes very emotionally dominant? Those are the methods that are available to you. There are no other methods. I know the world says there is, but there isn't. Every other thing they say is all just slight variations of the mind method. You know? So when they talk about neuro-linguistic programming, or when they talk about, dealing with energy, or when they talk about, all other forms of progress, well, they're all just using mind, right? And none of them are God's way. And so there's really just two paths. And this is what I said in the first century to everyone. There's really just two ways. There's the broad way, which most people take, right, that leads to the perfect natural man. In the Bible, it's now quoted as leading to destruction, which is not the case. I said it was leading to the perfect natural man. And then there's the narrow way that leads to infinite growth and life. God's way. They are the two ways. And every way that humankind have come up with and imagined themselves to have on earth has all been just the broad way, a part of the broad way. The broad way is like hundreds of thousands of different ways, all determined by different people and different suggestions, and they all end up at the same place. So in the end, it's just a great big wide way using all different methods to get to the same place. Right? And then there's this narrow way, which is a method that is the only way that God has defined to enter this relationship with God to the point where you become one with God and can live in a place of bliss that's forever progressing, always progressing, never staying the same.